Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about politics during the Age of Enterprise. So if you'd like to follow along, just open up the Age of Enterprise Politics PowerPoint and we'll get going here. Okay, so there's 5 presidents from 1877 to 1896. Um, 4 of them are Republicans and 1 of them is a Democrat. Grover Cleveland is the only Democrat, and he's kind of the weird president because he gets elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He's the 22nd and the 24th president. So he won an election, he lost an election, and then he won another election. So 3 times in a row he ran and he won the first and third times. I've got some maps I kind of want you to look at. Basically, it kind of shows you where the Republican and Democrat parties are popular. So typically, the Republicans are the party of the North. They do very well in the North. The only way a Democrat usually wins a northern state like New York is if they are from there. So, like Grover Cleveland, he was governor of New York, so he can win New York. Whereas if he had been governor of Texas, there's probably no way he could have won New York. So typically, the North is Republican, the South is heavily Democrat. 1877 is a weird. 1876 is a weird election, but as you can kind of see over time, the North is typically Republican and the South is solidly Democrat. That has a lot to do with the Civil War. Once you get to the 1890s, a little bit of this starts to break up because you have a new political party, the Populists, but we'll talk about them later. And generally, the Midwest and the West is kind of a toss-up. Sometimes it goes Republican, sometimes it goes Democrat. And the presidency is way different back then than it is today. You know, the presidency today is not really what it's supposed to be under our constitutional republic. You know, the president is not supposed to make as much policy as he does. And this is true Republicans, Democrats today, everybody, the president has more power than he's supposed to have. The president's supposed to enforce the laws and basically manage the country, not really steer it in a certain direction. Congress is actually supposed to be the most important part of government that kind of steers the country, and then the president kind of manages that. So we don't really follow that as much today, but that's how it's supposed to be. The duties of the president back then were very modest with today. They were the commander in chief of the armed forces. They're still that today. They enforce the laws as the executive branch of government. But the presidency leaves most issues up to Congress, especially the budget. There's about 100,000 federal employees. 56 of those are in the post office. The federal government makes most of its monies from tariffs and excise taxes. So there's no income tax at this time. There had been an income tax in the North and the South during the Civil War, but the Age of Enterprise, there's no income tax. Once we get to the Progressive Era in the 1900s, we'll start to get the income tax. If you look at slide 9, you can kind of see how the Republican and Democratic parties line up as far as issues. Generally, the Republicans favor a strong federal government, and I don't mean strong as like today. You know, the Republicans back then don't want to force everyone to purchase health insurance. They don't want an income tax. You know, it's strong central government for the time, not like what we have today. They favor civil rights for blacks. That's one reason why they're so popular in the North and not popular in the South, is they favor civil rights for blacks. They favor high tariffs. They're mostly Protestant. They're mostly located in the North. They want limits on alcohol. They see alcohol as a big problem in society. Big business favors them, and so do farmers. Democrats tend to be states' rights. Remember, that's what the Civil War had been fought over. In addition to slavery, you know, the Civil War is about slavery. That's the main reason the Civil War happened, but slavery is kind of seen as a states' rights issue, and there's other states' rights issues as well. Democrats favor segregation and blocking civil rights for blacks in the South. They favor a low tariff. They are Catholic in the North and Protestant in the South and the Midwest. They don't have a problem with alcohol. A lot of immigrants are Democrats, and they drink. You know, Catholics drink a lot. Laborers, the workers, tend to vote Democrat, and so do farmers, and they're more of a Southern party. An example of a tariff, the McKinley Tariff of 1890, tariff rates of tariff rates of almost 50%. And I'll explain tariffs a little later when we talk about the populace. Campaigning back then was way different than it was today, and I kind of wish we'd go back to this. Presidents didn't campaign typically. It was seen as beneath their dignity. You were supposed to be kind of a disinterested person. You're not becoming president because you want to. You're becoming president because people look at you and say, it's your duty. You are the person that can steer this country for now, so we want you to be president. So a lot of times presidents would sit at their home and receive visitors, and other people would go campaign for them. During this age of enterprise, Republicans do something called waving the bloody shirt. This happens all the time. So what happens is Republicans, when election comes around, they will say to the nation, remember who started the Civil War? It was the Democrats. And that's true. The Democrats did start the Civil War. The Democrats did not favor civil rights for blacks. They were opposed to that. So don't forget who started the Civil War. Don't forget who tried to destroy this nation. And don't vote for them. Vote for the Republicans because they tried to keep the nation together. So the Civil War often comes up. Sometimes Civil War pensions will come up. Usually Democrats don't favor Civil War pensions. They see it as extravagant spending. There's sometimes dirty campaigning. So, everyone always says that, the last presidential election was the dirtiest or the one before that was the dirtiest. That's not true. Presidential elections have been dirty, since the beginning of the founding of the republic. But it's dirty here as well. Supposedly, Grover Cleveland, who was the Democratic candidate in a number of elections, he had an illegitimate child and dodged the Civil War draft. So Republicans used to tease him. They would show up at his rallies where people spoke for him, and they would say, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" Grover Cleveland had a kid, but then left him, so the kid's wondering where his pa is. And then later on, after he won, the Democrats would they had this comeback. They would say, he's in the White House, ha, ha, ha. So kind of funny. The courts, back then, they tended to take a pro-property rights point of view in their decisions. The Supreme Court, in the 1900s, we'll see how this changes. But the Supreme Court basically said, look, it's our job to interpret the Constitution as written. And it doesn't really matter if it has a positive or negative impact on society. That's what the Constitution says. So if you don't like it that, a capitalist or an industrialist can have thousands of workers under him and pay them low wages, he built that factory. That's his property. You don't have a right to a job under the Constitution. If that needs to change, then the people of the United States need to change that by amending the Constitution. But the court says it's our job to interpret the Constitution as it's written. They tend to protect industrialists and property owners against attempts at reform. Another thing going on is the patronage or spoil system. Basically, what happens is American politics operates under the spoil system. If your candidate wins, you get to hand out jobs in government. So if the Democrats win, they go to Washington, they fire all the Republicans, even in jobs that aren't political, like the telegraph or the post office. And then they bring in the Democrats. If the Republicans win, they fire all the Democrats and they hire Republicans. Jay Gould was asked by Senator Henry Blair about this, and he said, the senator said, won't you please give us your idea about replacing a privately owned telegraph with a government-run telegraph? And Jay Gould said, I think that control by the government in such things is contrary to our institutions. If the government were controlled by the Democrats, it would be a Democrat telegraph. When the Republicans came to power, it would be a Republican telegraph. So this is kind of a big problem during this era. Local politics can also be really corrupt. George Washington Plunkett is this Tammany Hall boss. Tammany Hall is a political machine in New York. He talks all about politics. I'll let you read his statements on slides 17, 18, 19. But basically he says, what's wrong with using your political connections to get rich? I don't see the problem with that. One of the more famous political bosses was William Tweed. Like I said, he ran Tammany Hall, which was the political machine in New York. It's a Democrat political machine. I think usually the Democrats tended to be better organizers, so they usually have these political machines more. But what does a political machine do? Well, they kind of mix politics with social services. They provide families and immigrants with jobs. They help families in need. They go to weddings or funerals. They intercede on behalf of the family when it's facing a problem in government. So if you're a new immigrant, you come here, the local political boss comes down, welcomes you to the country, says, "Here's a welcome basket. I've got a job lined up for you. I expect you to vote Democrat in the next election." That's usually how it works. So it's a quid pro quo. It's help in return for votes. And you can kind of see the picture on slide 22. It kind of shows how they're handing out things. So this leads to a lot of corruption. Kind of a famous instance of this can even cause corruption when building things. The New York Country Courthouse construction started in the 1860s. It cost $13 million, goes way over budget, but it's a really beautiful building. One of these people that kind of was a cynic about politics, Thomas Nast, he's a cartoonist. He's critical of corrupt politics. He's got some famous cartoons. If you look at slide 28, you can see how this tiger, which represents corruption, the political machines, is mauling democracy. You can see how all these men are passing blame to the next person around them. You can see how the Senate is controlled by railroads in his political cartoons. One of the things that ends up happening is a president gets assassinated, and that kind of leads to the end of political spoils in a sense. Maybe not the end, but it starts to be the end. James Garfield is going to be that president whose death leads to this. He grew up in poverty. To some men, the fact that they came up from poverty is a matter of pride. "I lament sorely that I was born poor." That's what Garfield said. He worked as a laborer early on. There's a link on slide 31 if you want to watch. There's a great documentary about him. It talks about his life and kind of how he grew up, served in the Civil War, and how he ended up getting assassinated. It's a very great documentary, Murder of Our President. You should definitely watch it if you kind of are interested in that. I'm going to skip over some of his biographical information just because it's more important what kind of happened at the end. But one of the things that he does that recognizes, or not recognizes, one of the things he does that kind of shows the spirit of the age is basically he supports civil rights. That tends to be what the Republicans do. Remember, the Civil War is still big in everyone's mind. When he's campaigning, he waves the bloody shirt. If you see slide 38, this is a great quote. It kind of exemplifies what goes on at the time. He said, "We have seen white men betray the flag and fight to kill the Union." He's talking about the Democrats. "But in all that long and dreary war, you never saw a traitor under a black skin. In all that period of terror and distress, no Union soldier was ever betrayed by any black man anywhere. And as long as we live, we'll stand by those black allies of ours." So this is kind of bringing up the Civil War memory. "We will stand by them until the equal sunlight of liberty shall shine upon every man, black or white, in the Union. Citizens of New York, thank you for this magnificent demonstration. Thank you, thank you." Frederick Douglass, who's probably the most famous black man in America, he was a runaway slave, very prominent during the Civil War and kind of the build up to the Civil War. If you ever have a chance to read a biography about Frederick Douglass or even his own works, you should definitely do it. He's spot on with his commentary. He understands the mood of the country very well. He understands the point of view of a slave and then a freedman, because a lot of times that gets overlooked. But he says, "James Garfield must be our president. Colored men, I know Garfield. He is right on our questions. Take my word for it. He has shown us how man, in the humblest circumstances, can grapple with man, rise, and win." Frederick Douglass had been a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln and then a big supporter of Ulysses S. Grant. Garfield famously invited the Fisk Jubilee Singers, this black singing group, to come entertain him. Usually, the Democrats said this was awful. If the Republicans invite blacks to participate, a lot of times the Democrats would say, someday we're going to have interracial marriage. Black workers are going to steal your jobs, marry your daughters. So a lot of times the Democrats really ratcheted up the racial tension during the election because Republicans usually spoke up for black rights, civil rights. So that's another thing that's kind of interesting. We'll talk more about this later on. But blacks vote overwhelmingly Republican because of the Civil War, because Republicans ended slavery while Democrats wanted slavery to keep going. And what ends up happening is in the 1930s, blacks switch and they start voting for the Democrats. They don't vote for the Democrats because in the 1930s, the Democrats all of a sudden supported civil rights. The Democrats still opposed civil rights in the 1930s, but because of the Great Depression, FDR was seen as such a hopeful candidate that despite his lackluster care for civil rights, blacks voted for him because of jobs. So we'll talk more about that later. You can kind of see how the election turned. Um, what ends up happening is Garfield gets assassinated by this guy named Charles Guiteau. Basically, he's kind of a crazy guy, but he also wanted a job. He had supported Garfield, campaigned for him. He kind of gave a speech. Charles Guiteau had kind of a grandiose view of himself, and he thought because he supported Garfield, he deserved a job. And I think he wanted to be ambassador to Paris, some great job. He's not that big of a person in the political election, so he ends up assassinating the president in 1881. The president lived on for a long time, for weeks. He probably would have lived, but doctors kept digging in the bullet wound and reinfecting it and all this stuff. But Garfield dies. Um, Guiteau, like I said, is kind of seen as a crazy person. Um, and because of the death of Garfield, the Pendleton Act gets passed. This is civil service reform. It establishes a nonpartisan civil service commission that is authorized to fill federal jobs by examination. So basically, we're going to stop firing people based on their political party when the other party wins an election, and we're just going to let you be a civil servant regardless of your politics. Another kind of big thing going on during the age of enterprise with politics is something called social Darwinism. And basically, that's just the principles of Darwin's survival of the fittest applied to society at large. The Yale professor William Graham Sumner is the big proponent of social Darwinism in America. He writes two works, What Social Classes Owe Each Other and The Absurd Attempt to Make the World Over. You're going to read these. But basically, what social Darwinists argue is they argue private property is sacred, it's a constitutional right. Industrialization is a benefit to mankind, including workers. Before industrialization, maybe the rich and the poor are closer together, but they're also equally poor. But after industrialization, the gap between rich and poor is bigger, but everyone's better off. That's their argument. They argue that industrialization is here to stay. They said classes should not be at war with each other. Each class should respect and protect the rights of others. So, social Darwinists, they believe that the millionaire should be able to be protected by the law just as much as the poor person and vice versa. Humanity is just like nature. Some are more fit to survive and flourish. And this doesn't necessarily mean a racial part. There are some social Darwinists who become supporters of racial ideas. We'll talk about them later, the eugenicists with eugenics. But for now, social Darwinists basically say, look, people like Andrew Carnegie were meant to succeed because they worked hard, they had a brilliant mind, and they applied it. Not everyone has a brilliant mind or a great work ethic. And I'll let you kind of go through. You can read some of these quotes and kind of get a feel for what they believe, but you're going to read some of their works anyways in the documents. Horatio Alger was a big promoter of individualism. He writes a lot of popular books about working hard and making it big. Later, a lot of people criticize him. There's something called the Horatio Alger myth. Basically, the idea that if you work hard and dedicate your life, that's all you need to succeed. Some people criticize that, but some people say, no, that is all you need to succeed. And, that's still the argument we have today in America. Is America a land of opportunity? If you work hard and work smart, will you succeed? Well, most of the time, yes, you will. Millions of people still, drift on pieces of wood from Cuba to get here, or flee across the border, escaping violence in their countries. Millions of people still try to come here every year. It's not really like any other country in the world, so I tend to agree with this. But if you see the titles of his books, Strive and Succeed, Do and Dare, Risen from the Ranks, Struggling Upward, you can basically see how it's all about working hard and eventually you'll get ahead. But yeah, not everybody agrees with this. Henry Dearmas Lloyd, he's a journalist. He attacks free markets. He attacks the idea of the self-made man. He attacks monopoly. He wrote a pamphlet called Wealth Against Commonwealth. You're going to read part of that. He basically argues industrialization is harmful. Captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, they're not good for society. Bigness is bad. Competition is harmful to society. That's kind of a interesting thing. There's always this idea, is competition good or bad for society? Typically people that believe the government should be limited and want to succeed on their own, they tend to say competition is good. It allows things to get better. Usually people that want the government in charge of everything, they usually say competition is bad. But you can kind of read his quotes and get a feel for what he believes. Henry George is another journalist, a reformer. He wrote something called Progress and Poverty. I'm not going to have you read this, but you can read some of his quotes. If you're interested, you can find it on the internet. He said it's a crime committed by society that there's poverty. So poverty is society's creation, not an individual's, laziness or bad luck or whatever. He said everyone can be rich in society if it's tweaked enough. If we just manage society, if we just put the government in charge, we can make everything good. He talked about cutting taxes on capital and labor, having no ownership of land, and we would tax the land. Kind of some strange ideas, because if you don't have ownership of land, how do you tax the land? But they would tax the benefits of the land. You can kind of read some of his quotes and get a feel for what he believes. You have women's movements during this political age of enterprise. You have the National American Woman Suffrage Association. During the Civil War, women tried to get the right to vote. Black men got the right to vote, but not women, white or black women. So there's this new tactic during the age of enterprise. Instead of trying to get a constitutional amendment at the high level, let's do a state-by-state approach. Maybe we can get the right to vote in the state, and if enough states grant us the right to vote, we can vote at the national level. Women also advocate for the vote on local matters like school boards, tax issues, mayors. Retha Child Dorr, she kind of sums up, I think, what women felt. Women's place is home, but home is not certain or contained within the four walls of an individual house. Home is the community. The city full of people is the family. And badly do the home and the family need their mother. During the Progressive era, women would argue, look, if I am supposed to take care of my family, how can I take care of my family when there's trash on the street, when there's no job, when there's drunkenness everywhere? I need the vote, because that's one way I'm going to take care of my family. Women get involved in the temperance movement. The temperance movement is basically the idea that let's limit alcohol. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union is a big organization. And just because you can't vote, women are still involved in politics on an enormous scale. There's kind of this misconception that before the 19th Amendment, before women got the right to vote, they didn't take part in politics. That's not true. Women have always taken part in politics, and this is one of the ways they do it. Frances Willard is the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She argues for home protection. Basically, it's the woman's job to protect the home and the family. That's kind of the traditional view for women. But, like I said, you have to have the right to vote to protect your home. Lots of husbands get drunk after work because the saloon's on their way home from their factory job, and they've had a terrible day. They want to drink. Well, then they go home and they're drunk. They've blown some of their money. Women say we need the right to vote because we want to ban alcohol so that we can protect our home. So you can kind of see how they argue you need the right to vote to protect their home. There's some great political cartoons. They had all these campaigns. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So you're not going to get a kiss from your sweetheart if you drink. Wet or dry. Wet are people in favor of alcohol. Dries are people who think that you should limit alcohol or ban it outright. People would sign certificates that pledge not to drink alcohol. If you look at slide 91, you can kind of see what the saloon offers. We exchange misery for content, shame for honor, tribulation for peace. That's kind of what the saloon and then the idea of not drinking offers. Another thing going on is kind of racial politics, segregation. The South was redeemed in 1877, and what that means is during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Union military occupied the South and enforced civil rights. So the South actually had large numbers of blacks voting. Mississippi had 2 black senators to the United States Senate. There were dozens of congressmen. There were lieutenant governors. There were state congressmen and state senators. So blacks actually participated a lot and got elected because the Union military was there guaranteeing the right to vote. Well, in 1877, you have the end of Reconstruction, Civil War Reconstruction. The military withdraws from the South. So basically, the Democrats are back in charge. So redeemed means the South gets put back in Democrat hands, and blacks are slowly driven out of politics. Segregation pops up all over the place. You have something called gerrymandering. Basically, you draw legislative districts in weird shapes to assure a particular outcome. So Democrats in the South draw political districts in weird shapes so that basically the blacks are stuck in one place and can't really have a say in politics. There's other ways that the Democrats disenfranchise blacks: the literacy test, the poll taxes, intimidation. Before, the Union military would be at the voting booth and you'd have Union soldiers there. So when blacks come to vote, they get to vote. When Democrats come to vote, they also get a vote, but they can't drive the blacks off. Now that the Union military is gone, if you are a black person and you're in the South, you go to the voting booth and you might have the Ku Klux Klan there or another white Democrat group. The Ku Klux Klan is a part of the Democratic Party basically in the South, and they don't let you vote. So they have all kinds of ways that they try to force blacks from not voting. You can kind of see the picture on slide 95. That's kind of what it was like in the South. You have Jim Crow laws, basically laws to enforce segregation. And there's a really important case about segregation on trains. And this is really important. Homer Plessy, this is the guy that this revolves around. So in the 1890s, Louisiana passed a law that basically said whites and blacks have to sit on separate railroad cars. So the law required equal facilities. So the black train car and the white train car have to be just as nice. They have to have just as many seats, the same kind of seats, but you can force them to be separate. A group of Louisiana lawyers challenges the law. Homer Plessy, he was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. Now, according to Democrats in the South, if you have any black heritage, in your blood, then you're considered black. It doesn't matter what you look like, it's what is in your blood. And so Homer Plessy, even though he looks white, he's considered black by Democrats in the South. He purchases a ticket for the white train car. He sits there. He's asked to leave. He refuses and gets arrested. So you have this Supreme Court case, and this is really important. It's called Plessy v. Ferguson. Basically, Plessy's lawyers argue that the Louisiana law violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and also the 13th Amendment. The case reaches the Supreme Court. The court rules 7-1 that segregation does not violate the Constitution as long as the facilities are equal. So that idea of separate but equal, that's from Plessy v. Ferguson. So it allows segregation based on race as long as both things are equal. So when we get to the 1950s, this is going to get overturned, and we'll talk about how that works out. Justice Henry Brown, he ruled that the equality stipulated in the 13th and 14th Amendment is only political and civil, not social. he famously said, "If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane." But Justice John Harlan, he was the lone dissenter. He said this: "I deny that any legislative body or judicial tribunal may have regard to the race of citizens which the civil rights of those citizens are involved. Indeed, such legislation as that here in question is inconsistent not only with that equality of rights which pertain to citizenship, national and state, but with the personal liberty enjoyed by everyone within the United States. In the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." So Plessy v. Ferguson is the law of the land until the 1950s. But remember the name John Harlan, because when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, I'm going to bring up something kind of interesting. But basically, you have, this has always been true of America. You have some people favoring segregation and arguing for it, but you also have people arguing against it. So there's kind of always this battle of what road America is going to take. So next time we'll kind of talk about foreign policy in America, and I'll see you then.